This is going to be a pretty quick show. I wanted to hop on the mic for a bit to talk about two big recent stories in Florida that on the surface may seem disconnected, but which are absolutely related to each other. And more importantly, they illustrate one of the key authoritarian tactics that we are seeing used here in Florida and nationally right now. Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents, which is a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular focus on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. That name, Seeking Rents, comes from a term in economics called rent seeking. And rent seeking is what's happening when someone with lots of wealth and influence, like a big business or a billionaire, uses their wealth and influence to get laws changed in their favor in a way that allows them to capture even more wealth and influence for themselves, usually at the expense of someone else. The first story I want to talk about is a recent controversy in Orlando, where, as I've mentioned before, that's where I am. And it involved the mayor of Orange County. Orange County is the county that includes the city of Orlando, and the county commission here, who when they refused to sign what was essentially a transport agreement with ICE, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. This transport agreement would have allowed correctional officers at the county jail to transport people who are being held on behalf, immigrants being detained on behalf of ICE in the county jail, allowed them to transport them to ICE facilities. And essentially, we're talking about going down to Miami and to, more specifically, this internment camp the DeSantis administration has built in the middle of Everglades, the place that a whole bunch of ghoulish and poison-souled politicians have gleefully nicknamed Alligator Alcatraz. This was a transport agreement essentially to let county jail guards make the drive down to the Everglades and back, on behalf of ICE, taking detainees from the jail to this detention camp in the Everglades. And as I said, the mayor and county commission here refused to sign this agreement. And when they did, they were immediately threatened by James Othmeyer, who is the former Ron DeSantis aide, who is now the state's attorney general. DeSantis personally appointed him attorney general, which is essentially the top law enforcement job in the state. This is when the job came opening because Ashley Moody, the elected attorney general, was appointed to a U.S. Senate seat. So this guy, James Othmeyer, the DeSantis aide who's now attorney general, never actually elected to this position. But he's become something of a legal enforcer for the governor. And James Othmeyer essentially threatened the mayor of Orange County and the county commission, declaring that they were breaking two laws. One was a law that sort of generally requires local governments to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement, and another was a law that forbids quote unquote sanctuary policies that would essentially allow where local governments may try and sort of thwart the enforcement of immigration policy and deportations, that sort of thing. Othmeyer unilaterally declared Orange County was breaking both of these laws, and then threatened that the governor would suspend them if they continued to break these laws. And the thing about this is, despite the fact that the attorney general said Orange County was breaking these laws, his claims, when you actually go to the specific points he was making, were at best legally debatable, at worst utter bullshit. And so let's just unpack it a little here. So the first law he claimed that Orange County was breaking by refusing to sign this ICE transport agreement was a law that requires local governments, generally requires local governments to, quote unquote, use best efforts to support the enforcement of federal immigration law. Use best efforts. The law does not require you to do anything or do whatever you're told. It requires you to use best efforts to support federal immigration enforcement. And here's why that matters. There were actually policy reasons that Orange County was reluctant to sign this jail transport agreement. This wasn't simply, we're trying to thwart the Trump administration in any way we can. The Orange County jail, like so many prisons, basically every prison in Florida, is badly understaffed. It's already below critical staffing levels. So if you're talking about taking people out of rotation so they can do a day-long trip down to this cartoonishly evil camp in the middle of the Everglades, detention camp in the middle of the Everglades, that just makes the situation even worse for everybody behind. It makes the guards still work, the corrections officers still working in the jail. They're in they're in more danger now because the staffing levels, which were already critically low, are even lower now. It makes things more dangerous for the people the people being jailed, the prisoners in the jail. It creates like a real issue here, a real safety concern if you're taking even more people out of rotation in a place that is already badly understaffed. So at best, it was subjective as to whether or not they should sign this, but certainly there's no debate that they had to sign it, right? And if you think that's what the law says, what you do is you go to court and try and get it enforced that way. And they didn't do that. He just declared that they were breaking this law. And that brings us to the second one. He also said they were breaking a law that prohibits local governments from enacting sanctuary policies. And his argument was essentially that by refusing to sign this jail transport agreement, that was a de facto sanctuary policy. Except when you go to that law and you read what a sanctuary policy is, it is defined as a policy that quote prohibits or impedes a law enforcement agency from complying with immigration enforcement efforts. Again, this didn't prohibit or impede anybody from doing this. ICE can still take the people being detained at the Orange County Jail to Alligator Alcatraz if that's what they want to do. This was about Orange County employees doing it for them. This is not a sanctuary policy. Again, it strikes me that you could make a slightly stronger legal argument on this point, although, again, at best a jump ball here, right? But again, the Attorney General just straight out declared that the county was breaking the law and then used that as the basis to say that the governor might suspend the mayor and the county commission from office using the Florida Constitution gives the governor of Florida like broad latitude, broad power to suspend local government officials. This is, I guess credit due to Ron DeSantis for discovering just how broad that power is. Even though that's been around for a while, every governor before him has been incredibly restrained when it comes to suspending locally, independently elected officials. Generally speaking, to my knowledge, it had only before Ron DeSantis ever been invoked in cases where, a mayor or a county commissioner or a school board member was indicted for a felony charge. Basically, you had to be facing criminal charges to get suspended by the governor. This governor has started using this power to suspend people over like policy agreements. He's undoing local elections over policy agreements. This is the most famous case of this was the prosecutor in Tampa, the independently elected state attorney in Tampa. He suspended after that prosecutor said he would not prosecute women seeking abortions in Florida or doctors providing abortions. And so this is a real threat now. I mean, you've got, again, the top cop in the state of Florida now declaring that you've broken the law, and the guy who used to be the chief of staff to the governor telling you that the governor is going to suspend you under this, or he might suspend you because of this, right? So this is not idle threats coming from. This is not just like, some guy popping off on Twitter about this. This is real stuff. And Orange County did ultimately back down here. The mayor of Orange County, a guy by the name of Jerry Demings, former sheriff, by the way, ultimately agreed to sign this ICE transport agreement under these threats. And this was a decision that sort of upset a lot of activists and people that have been working on like fighting for like due process rights, fighting for immigrant rights, fighting for just to hold the line on authoritarian creep. A lot of people were disappointed by this decision, which I understand, but I got to tell you, I think I ultimately just personally landed with Jerry Demings, and his argument for this was he did not want to take the chance that the governor would be able to remove him and the entire county commission and replace them with his handpicked appointees. Voters of Orange County would have no say over the matter. And the thing is, we in Orange County have seen just how bad that can be. We had this situation where our supervisor of elections resigned early and gave Ron DeSantis the chance to put one of his flunkies in that office. He did, a guy by the name of Glenn Gilzine, who has been one of Ron DeSantis' go-to cronies when he needs to fill someone. This is a guy who was installed as the head of the DeSantis-controlled district at Disney when he took over the Reedy Creek Improvement District. And Glenn Gilzine was made supervisor of elections of Orange County for I think like 9 months, a little less than a year. And in that time, he basically ransacked the place. I mean, everybody wrote stories about this, but I'll throw a link into the show notes. So one sort of deep dive story we did based on records that showed just like hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars in taxpayer money going out the door to friends and allies and Republican political operatives. He quite literally bankrupt the place. He went the supervisor of elections office while Gilzine was in charge. I had to go to court and say they were not going to have enough money to meet payroll, right? And so, if you create a situation where the governor is going to be able to suspend the mayor and the entire board of county commissioners, you're looking at a situation where not only will you have a local elected body that is governing in a way that would be completely opposed, diametrically opposed to the wishes of the constituents, the voters they claim to represent, but you'd also have a bunch of people that would probably be like stripping the wiring out of the building and that sort of stuff, selling everything off for parts while they could. So, like I said, I was sympathetic to the decision to back down in the face of these threats. Although, as we'll talk about in a bit, there are other options available to Orange County and others. But before we get to that, I want to talk about the other story that is absolutely connected to this. And this has been focused more in Hillsborough County. This is where the city of Tampa is, although it's a statewide issue. And this is the ongoing bullying and threatening and harassing that is happening by the DeSantis administration to schools in order to get them to remove more books from school libraries that the DeSantis administration, or more specifically, a bunch of fringe far-right activists that they are pandering to, do not want in school libraries. And this is being led by the governor's office, by also James Othmeyer, again playing a key role here, but also the key person in this is yet another DeSantis aide who was made recently made the state's new commissioner of education commissioner, a guy by the name of Stasi Kamutsis, I think is how you say it. And what they have been doing is essentially going as far as to threaten criminal prosecutions against school districts, school officials that do not remove books that they think should be removed. And what they're doing is they are singling out books that have any kind of sexual content in them. It could be, without regard to context whatsoever. It could be a 400-page book where a couple of characters at some point have sex, as human beings fucking do from time to time. It could be a paragraph in this 400-page book. They highlight that and they say that this book is pornographic. It should be out of schools. And if you don't remove it, you're putting yourself at risk of criminal prosecution. Has come up in some of these threats, not just suspension in this case. And this is completely beyond any sort of legal basis. So, a couple of things to understand. First, it is illegal. Schools cannot put obscene materials in libraries. This is against the law federally. It's against the law in Florida, and it was against the law in Florida long before Ron DeSantis showed up and decided that becoming a culture war crusader was his best path to power in the modern Republican Party. But the thing about obscenity laws is there is like a rich history of case law, Supreme Court case law around this stuff. Context matters, right? A big part of what you have to do to decide whether something is obscene is evaluate it in larger context. Does the material have any sort of literary or scientific value or artistic value, for instance? You can't just isolate like one paragraph out of 400 pages and declare it obscene, right? But the state of Florida, which absolutely knows this, by the way, passed a law a couple of years ago that tried to get around that and kind of like said you can't have stuff that's obscene or pornographic or describes sexual content, describes any kind of sexual content. They left it kind of vague as to what they were talking about, and they've been weaponizing that vagueness, and they've been, like I said, using essentially seizing on passages in books that they taking them out of context and using that to just declare them pornographic, when even though local school districts have not only locally elected school officials and school districts not only have the right to sort of evaluate these works to decide whether or not they are actually pornographic or obscene or anything, they actually have the legal obligation to do this, because again, it is unconstitutional to just ban stuff based on their content without any sort of analysis of the context here. But yet, if school districts aren't pulling these books, if they're exercising the discretion that they should be exercising, Ron DeSantis, James Othmeyer, and Stasi Kamutsis have been threatening them until they do, and essentially pressuring school districts into pulling even more books out of Florida. Yes, we are still in 2025 banning more books in Florida. This is like Florida's like jam is banning books. It's become it is the national leader in book banning, it seems like. Jeff Solacek, a longtime education writer at the Tampa Bay Times, actually had a really good story about this. I'm going to throw a link into the show notes. This is part of what sort of like got my got me thinking I needed to get on the mic to talk about these. And he had a story about sort of the tactics that Stasi Kamutsis is using as education commissioner. And in there was a quote in there from an Alachua school board member, and what she said was, quote, "I think he's trying to chill the speech of anyone who does not agree with him in the current administration." And let me say that again. I think he, Stasi Kamutsis, is trying to chill the speech of anyone who does not agree with him and the current administration, the DeSantis administration. And that is exactly what they are doing. And they're using the threats of suspensions and criminal prosecutions to do it because the law is not on their side. They're bullying people into breaking the law in this case. So what needs to happen? Because again, on the school, just like Orange County backed down and signed that ICE agreement, most of these school districts seem to be deciding just it's easier to remove these books. Like there was another story recently about how so many of these books, like how rarely they get checked out anyway. And you've got a bunch of school districts deciding it's just easier to like placate these guys in Tallahassee, remove the books, and like so we can focus on stuff that like our voters actually care about here, rather than just getting into these knockdown, drag out fights over the wishes of a few fringe people on the right, and that are going to be engaged by people with lots of power and acting in absolute bad faith. So what needs to happen here? Well, there are a few things that you could do to try and push back on this. And it seems to me that the first thing is cities, counties, and school boards absolutely need to make sure they have lawyers who know the law in detail, who know what the law actually is, and not just whatever the fuck little James Uthmeyer says it is, and leaders who know when and how to push back against this stuff and to do it in a way that is both defiant and public, and explain it to people so they understand what is going on here. The other thing local governments need to do is get their vacancy policies in order at this point. It seems to me that this is the new reality, that from here on out, governors, this is going to, one of Ron DeSantis' chief legacies is going to be that governors are going to start using this suspension power as an absolute cudgel against any local official that tries to defy them in any way. And so local governments need to be thinking about this and making sure they have explicit policies and procedures for filling vacancies, so it doesn't just become the governor gets to choose whoever they want in this spot. And this is, by the way, this isn't just a thing that like Democratic areas like Orange County need to be thinking about it. Republican voters, Republican areas need to be thinking about this too, because the one thing that has become very clear the last few years is sort of the wishes of like the sort of approach of like Republican leaders at the local level conflict with the sort of the on high from dictates from Tallahassee as much as blue areas do. Like one example happening right now in Manatee County, where there is a big push to restore protections for wetlands, some really strong protections from wetlands that stop developers from destroying wetlands, that were the board had eliminated these protections, and then voters like essentially revolted and threw out a bunch of incumbent politicians, elected a board essentially about as clear as you can get to a mandate in this stuff to restore these wetlands protections. The DeSantis administration is trying to stop that from happening. They're weaponizing a hurricane recovery law that has this broad prohibition on local governments in theoretically in hurricane impact areas, but it actually applies everywhere the way it was written. This law that prohibits them from setting stronger land development regulations for a period of time following a storm for like a couple of years. This is like, we talked about this real quickly on a recent podcast. This Senate Bill 180 is the latest iteration of this, and it's quickly becoming one of the biggest stories in Florida politics. But the DeSantis administration is using that law to try and stop Manatee County from restoring protections from wetlands. Like, what is going on? This is absolutely doing the bidding of developers. But you're into situations where if the DeSantis administration is going to take the position that you've broken the law, this is the sort of thing you got to be looking over your shoulder about. And so it is incumbent that any community that wants its local elected officials to have any bit of empowerment to be able to make decisions, the local officials, the ones you actually run into in the grocery store, the elections that are the least shielded by like gerrymandered districts or the least imbalanced by like overwhelming financial advantages, the elections, in other words, that voters actually have the most impact on. If you want those elections to matter, you need your governments to have vacancy policies sorted out, procedures for that sorted out. And the last part about this is local governments and others need to be going on offense on some of this stuff. So I mentioned Orange County agreed to signed this ICE transport agreement, and And as I said, I think I land on the side of I think that was the right decision given the context of what you're dealing with. But you can also start putting the going on offense some of this. So another city, the city of South Miami, has actually sued Ron DeSantis right now in a lawsuit that is designed over the same issue about whether or not this law requiring you to use best efforts to support immigration enforcement actually requires you to sign these kinds of agreements regardless, like whatever your analysis is. Like, do you have to use best efforts or do you just have to follow orders? What does this law really mean? And they've gone to court trying to get clarity on this issue. If this goes back to the point, if we can't just allow a bad faith attorney general to declare what the law is and then use that and allow that to be the basis for the governor suspending people. This is the role of courts at this point. We need courts to declare these laws. So many of the laws that Florida has passed in the last few years have been intentionally vague for this exact purpose, to allow the administration to go much further with it, to give legislators plausible deniability that say, well, we didn't do that. We just look what we wrote on paper. It's very reasonable, but it allows it to be, it's so vague, it gets applied in the most unreasonable of ways. And so pushing back, getting clarity. Listen, a lot of these lawsuits are not going to work, right? We've got a series of judges in Florida at this point who seem to specialize in using standing arguments to dodge any kind of making any decisions when doing so might sort of upset the DeSantis administration. No matter how outlandish his legal positions might be. Like we've seen claims the governor has tried to invent an executive privilege for a Florida governor in order to avoid complying with public records laws. We've seen him literally argue in court that one of the state's main anti-corruption laws does not apply to the governor as senior political appointees. These are utter bullshit legal positions to take, but you've had judges in the cases where they've come up have found procedural reasons not to actually address the issue. They're not so stupid as to buy the governor's legal arguments and sort of cement these positions in the case law, but they're not willing to upset him in a way and so they find a reason not to just wipe their hands of the case, get rid of it without ever without ever resolving the actual issue, and just kind of leave us in this legal gray area that again seems to be where the Ron DeSantis and James Othmeyers and Stasi Kamutzes of the world, that's where they want us to be, in this gray area where they can decide what the law is. But the thing is, sometimes these lawsuits really do work. And this brings me to the other story that got me thinking about this today. Was a federal judge just declared, I mentioned the book banning stuff has been relying on a law that tries to create like a loophole around sort of obscenity laws, right? Like under obscenity, you very clearly have to consider the context, and the state of Florida has tried to kind of expand that so it can just ban anything it doesn't like, anything that's got any kind of sexual content in it, regardless of the context. And anything, sexual content gets quickly bastardized into these gray areas to mean anything that might have to do with sexuality gets banned as pornography. So, a book about, a teenager going through puberty can suddenly become pornographic under this world. Anyway, this law that they've been they've been relying on to do this, federal judge just declared it unconstitutional, threw it out. And this was, I never thought I'd be on the same side of the plaintiffs in this lawsuit included Penguin Random House and HarperCollins and a bunch of big publishers. Never thought I'd be on the same side as them. Although also a bunch of authors like John Green, happy to be on the same side of them in that case. But as a lawyer for Penguin Random House said in a story about this ruling, this was a complete knockout. The judge, if you read this opinion, and I'm going to throw a link to the opinion into the show notes too, the judge walks through in great detail just exactly the game that has been playing here. It goes through exactly how the DeSantis administration has been trying to avoid its legal obligations to consider and allow people to consider the context of stuff before banning groups. There was the ruling was just whole cloth. Like the court said, the court must conclude that there is no constitutional application of a prohibition against books containing material that quote unquote described sexual conduct. A book that makes a reference to making love is not pornography, Ron DeSantis. Sorry, James Othmeyer. That's just what the law is. And that not what you want it to be, I'm sure, but you could actually try and get it changed and show people just how far you actually want to go and put it down in writing and then see what happens. And the other thing about this case, by the way, is it shows just how bananas things have gotten in Florida on the book banning front. So one part of this case, the judge's opinion went through a bunch of the books that have been banned in Florida. And just for the sake of people that might think this is crazy, or that might not understand, they kind of tune out when they hear some of this stuff because it's just culture. These are books that have been removed from school libraries around the state under this law they passed, and that the bullying and harassing and threatening stuff that has been coming out of Tallahassee. I'm going to read the list that was in the actual judge's opinion. The Color Purple, Half of a Yellow Sun, Cloud Atlas, The Splendid and the Vile, I Am Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter, The Freedom Writer's Diary, How a Teacher and 150 Teens Used Writing to Change Themselves and the world around them. On the Road, Jack Kerouac, that's been banned. That's been banned in places. 19 Minutes, Paper Towns, Looking for Alaska, John Green book. How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents, The Kite Runner, Slaughterhouse-Five, Shout, Last Night at the Telegraph Club, The Handmaid's Tale. Boy, if anything was ever on the nose, it's the state of Florida trying to have The Handmaid's Tale banned from school libraries. Native Son, Kaffir Boy, The True Story of a Black Youth's Coming of Age in Apartheid South Africa. Gee, I wonder why that one got banned. Water for Elephants, Beloved, Song of Solomon, The Bluest Eye, and Homegoing. This is just a sampling of stuff that has been removed from some libraries under now we can just say unconstitutional law. So, and I say all this, I go through all this to point out that fighting back, even though it won't always work, it does work sometimes, and it's worth doing. Get on offense on some of this stuff, because it is the ways we are allowing, the lawless ways we are allowing the DeSantis administration to push people right now, and the way people are getting bullied through, I keep coming back to this, bullshit interpretations of the law, and essentially this authoritarian wielding of powers in enforcement of laws that don't actually exist, right? Of what laws they want to exist, but that don't actually exist. It needs to be stopped, and unfortunately, this is one of the only tools available to folks right now, and people need to be more cognizant, especially local elected leaders. I'm stealing this quote from somewhere that I read. I apologize. I don't remember which local official went and said it. I think it was in the context of Senate Bill 180. But oftentimes local government officials are reluctant to spend lots of money on lawsuits and stuff, because you end up spending a lot of money on expensive lawyers, and if you can end up having to pay legal fees for if you lose, the way some of these laws have been written to favor in the case of Senate Bill 180, developers trying to challenge laws. But increasingly, I think this is a case. This goes back to also local government officials have to be more proactive about making their arguments and explaining to people why they're doing what they're doing and the stakes of this stuff. And I think you'll find a lot of people across the aisle, this is not just Democrats and independents, but a lot of Republican voters too, will actually support you spending money in a way that actually fights for people's rights, fights for home rule, and fights against these the lawless use of power that we're seeing coming out of Tallahassee. So, okay, I'm going to leave it there. Quick reminder, click like or subscribe, help spread the show around to others. And if you haven't already, please think about signing up for a subscription. Easiest way to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. Subscriptions are free, but there is an option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you can afford one. We'll be back again soon with another show coming out of some of the records we obtained out of the Florida legislature. Until then, take care.